So welcome everybody. We're thrilled to have you in the second evening panel. I see there's a lot of, maybe Colin will go to the next slide. I see there's already a lot of questions. And so we'll just say for the students, just to be clear, seminars start this week. So you'll get an opportunity tomorrow, Thursday or Friday, depending on when your seminar is, to ask your teaching assistant a lot of these questions. As well after tonight's class, but give it about an hour or two, depending on how efficient Ryan and I are. We will post the 3 questions for this week. So reminder that every week for 10 of the weeks, we have short weekly assignments, and they are always given to you on Tuesday evening, and they're due the next Monday at 5. And you only have to do 6. We count the best 6, but you can do as many as 10 if you want to improve your grade. So the first one comes tonight. So there were a lot of questions last time about the short weekly assignment. I think after you've seen the first one tonight, you'll get a better sense of the style of questions and what to expect. And just remember, you have lots of flexibility in there for if things happen or if you want to improve your grade. And then a reminder that your TA is always there to answer questions. You'll meet them this week, and then you can always reach us at the email univ2020@uoguelph.ca. And I'll let Ryan present the next slide.
Yeah, so we've talked a little bit about how to keep things a little more organized and a little more manageable. You may recall we talked last class that we've increased the size of the course this semester, so there's a lot more people in the chat and so on. So what we're going to do starting tonight is we're going to try to reserve the chat within the Zoom meeting here for questions related to the discussion, questions for the panelists, that sort of thing directly related to the Zoom meeting itself. If there are other questions about logistics for the course, you'll have a chance to talk to your TA in your seminars. You have the CourseLink site. And if those don't resolve the issue, you also have the course email. In terms of any other discussions that you're interested in having, we saw a lot of really vigorous chat back and forth, slightly tangential to the main topics, but we certainly don't want to discourage people exploring topics. But we ask that you use that CourseLink forum for that, or any other. I believe last time there was some discussion about setting up a separate chat room for that sort of stuff. But here we'll talk mostly about the topics presented by the panelists and keep our questions mostly focused on the current discussion. We are going to try to incorporate as many of the questions. Often there's just so many flying by that we try to merge a few of them into a single question, or it inspires the question that we ask. So don't worry too much if your particular question isn't read out aloud. It probably is going to contribute to the discussion in one way or another, and you will have an opportunity in your smaller seminar groups to explore areas that you were particularly interested in more detail. So just with the volume of people and the volume of chat traffic that's going on, we're trying to kind of just keep it so we can actually read it before it scrolls right past. So really much appreciate that. And again, the email that you want to send to, if you have questions about the course, univ2020@uoguelph.ca. And I'll just, generally speaking, if an email comes to Sophie or me, we're ending up mostly forwarding to that email anyway, so it's all in one place. So you kind of save yourself a step if you go directly to that email. So I guess this is still me. All right then. So
Ryan, I think this is a theme of you always asking, oh, is it me? Is it me presenting? Is it still me?
Well, because I don't rehearse. You know how it is. You lose the spontaneity if you rehearse or know what's going on. Did Minglong make his way back in yet? If not, we're going to just flip the order around a little bit. I'm guessing there might be some.
Here.
Oh, you are here. Great. Fantastic. Colin, I didn't. Oh, you're co-host now. Okay, so nothing is changing. We're carrying on with the evening as planned. So as we did last time, and it's what we'll do each week, we'll introduce the panelists. There's generally 3 or 4 each week, and we'll introduce them in order immediately before their presentation, just so you have fresh in your mind who each person is. and then we'll have the sort of open discussion involving everyone. You're welcome to ask questions during the presentations. Sometimes panelists will answer questions, not so much while they're presenting, but while one of the others is presenting. You can capture your questions. We do kind of scroll back up to see if we've missed anything that has come up as we get later into the discussion. So one last point before we get started. There's often questions about should we be taking notes and that sort of thing. That's entirely up to you. The course does not contain any assessment or exams or anything of that nature that would require you to have detailed notes. It's my recommendation would be more to engage intellectually with the discussion. So listen and think about how, what it makes you think of, ask questions, and really participate in a meaningful way in your discussion seminars. But as far as, are there going to be examination questions of trivia? Do I have to memorize this or that? Absolutely not. Totally not the point of a course like this. So it's up to you if you want. And as you know, the sessions are all also being recorded, so you can go back and revisit if there's a particular piece of information you want to review. But no, you don't have to worry about memorizing trivia in any way in this course. It's really about engaging with the ideas. So with that said, I'm really, really pleased to introduce Minglan Gong, who's as I mentioned, Minglan, just so you know, when you vanished, I said maybe he's not quite sure how to use the computer. And then I had to explain, which I'll repeat now, that he's the director of the School of Computer Science at the University of Guelph. His research interests cover various topics in the broad area of visual computing, including computer graphics, computer vision, visualization, image processing, pattern recognition. And he's currently conducting research related to COVID-19 in a project entitled Social Distance Monitoring through Real-Time Crowd Density Estimation. So we're really glad to have you with us tonight, Minglan, and we'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Let me turn on my camera as well. Okay, so here I am. Thank you for the introduction. So it's my pleasure to talk about modeling and visualizing the COVID-19. So I indeed had issue early on, and I don't hear any sound from my laptop. I had to reboot, and then the problem magically go away. Anyway, so before I start, the first thing I like to talk about is actually compare our current COVID-19 pandemic with the pandemic we had in history that is almost exactly 1 century ago. So as we know, in 1918, we experienced the so-called Spanish flu, is influenza caused by the H1N1 virus. So if we compare the two pandemics, we know that both are caused by novel virus, which means that nobody have immunity against those viruses. And both viruses are highly effective, so they spread quickly among population, so that's the issue, and both are deadly. The H1N1 killed 20 to 100 million people, which is estimated by the researchers later on. And nowadays we know COVID-19 have took 2 million lives so far, so the number is still growing. But there are differences. So one difference is that nowadays we have a lot more international travels, and the economic is highly integrated around the world. So the virus spread faster and is impacting every corner of the world. But the good news is that our science and technology are much more advanced. So we have vaccine developed in less than a year, so which is great news. That is not even thought to be possible even last year, right? At the start of the pandemic, nobody thought that we can have a vaccine so fast. And in terms of information technology, we also see a lot of many changes. for this between the two pandemic. And back then there is no IT at all, and now we have online meetings, support online interactions, and we also entered the big data era. So there are a lot of, as a computer scientist, I'll focus on the impact of COVID-19 on IT, as well as the impact of IT for fighting the COVID. So there are some nice articles which I have provided a link here to talk about how the pandemic have boosted the growth of the digital platform, such as social media and online learning. So even though these social media or online teaching and learning experience will eventually grow, but the pandemic certainly speed up the progress. On the other hand, the digital technology also made strong impact in fighting against the COVID-19 in many fronts. So this included decision-making support for pandemic response, as well as using artificial intelligence in protein structure prediction that can help to combat the virus. Okay, so the core of the digital technology is the data. So even before the pandemic, we know that data is highly valuable. So there are phrases such as data is a new oil or new gold in the digital era. The pandemic make us further realize the importance of data accuracy and data sharing. So there are articles on these topics as well. The data itself is just numbers. So it's hard to, sometimes even impossible to comprehend if we just being presented the numbers. So the visualization come in here to make data easier for human to comprehend. So that is what data visualization is about. So I'm sure you all have seen a simple plot like this. So on the top, we have the daily new cases plotted over time. And on the bottom, we have the number of deaths over time as well. So after showing the data in such a simple plot, human can easily observe the trend of how the virus are spreading. So we can see that we had a peak back in May, and it's the number of new cases slowed down in July, but it's coming back up again. We can also see that the number of new cases nowadays is almost 4 times as what we had in May, so which is quite bad. But a somewhat encouraging observation is that the number of deaths we have is not 4 times as much as what we had in May. So you can see right now the death toll per day is roughly or maybe fewer than what we had in May. So this, comparing the two plots, this suggests that the fatality rates may have dropped since the beginning of the pandemic. So different researchers have different hypotheses on why this is happening. Okay, so besides plotting the cases by time, we can plot them by geographical region. So we can see that how different provinces and territories have the number of cases we have there. So we can see that Quebec, Ontario have the highest number of cases. We can see the Alberta is also hit hard. Okay, we can also zoom in within the Ontario. We can see what are the number of cases in different health regions. So here the visualization shows that the Toronto area, the Toronto health region has the highest number of cases, that is about 75,000. So, but given the same data, how to present it also convey different messages. So if we, knowing the number of cases, if we present them as a total cases per health region, this is what we see, which is Toronto is the highest number. But if we present the data as how many cases we have per 100,000 people, 100,000 population in the region, then we have a different message. So here we can see that the Windsor area and the Peel area is actually were hardest hit area rather than Toronto. So these two areas have the infection rate of over 3%, and the Toronto area is actually not as high. So considering these two areas are less populated as Toronto, so that kind of bring a very interesting question on why these two areas were hit hard, right? So different people may have different interpretations on the observation. For example, I may hypothesize that these two areas are gateways for international travel. So therefore, one is the Pearson Airport, the other is connection to the key connection to the US. So these are probably the reason that these two areas are infected at a higher rate. So information such as this can help health official, government to make decisions. Ideally, if we know, if we have the data on where the new cases appear and when the active new cases appear, we can visualize them using this kind of spatial and temporal animation. So we see that the new dots popping up, indicating there is a new case. And then it may, if the case is resolved, that will disappear. So this will show how the virus spread across, right? So this is a plot for Hong Kong region. So they do have the data, then this is a visualization result. So such visualization helps to, again, helps health official to make decisions on what whether there is a lockdown needed or what is needed for control the spread. We do have locally, we do have data that are more detailed, more zoomed in. So, for example, we can see the information on where are the outbreaks occur. So in this plot, outbreak are plotted using the blue dots. So whenever there is, say there is a grocery store or there is a company have multiple cases, there will be declared outbreak and they will be shown in the map here. But the data here is not really accurate because they are based on the news reports. So news reports may not pick up all the cases. If you have the raw data, if you can process the raw data, and then it will help to generate more accurate visualization. Besides showing the case information based on the time or based on the geographic region, we can also analyze based on the age and gender, break down the cases by age and gender. So here we can see on the left-hand side is the total number of cases. We see that the young population who are in their 20s contributed most of the cases. Okay, 10% of the cases are female between 20 and 29, and 11% is male between the same age. So altogether contribute to 21% of the all cases. Okay, so but if you look at the figure on the right hand, it's clearly shows that the fatality, the death toll occurs among the senior citizens. So those in their 90s or 80s have a higher so if you add them together, it's more than 50% of the deaths, contribute more than 50% of the deaths. Here, we also need to, when you look at the data, you may you may see the observation that, okay, there are female deaths is higher than male deaths from this among this senior group. For example, it's a 22% of people over 90 that is 22% of the deaths are female over 90, and only 11%, which is half, is male over 90. But here, we always need to be careful of when we interpret the data like this, because this could very well be the reason that there are more senior female person than a male person. So if the female population is twice as much as a male population for over 90, then this could be the reason behind the difference among the gender group. But nevertheless, we can compare the two figures. We can observe easily through the visualization. We can observe that for young people, the COVID-19 is indeed feel like a regular flu or a little more severe than flu. But then it's actually the senior citizens are taking the pin, so they are being hit even though they don't account for many cases. The death toll are mainly appear to be on the hitting the senior citizens hard. Okay, so computer science can be used not only to just display the data, they can also be used to analyze the data and generate new data. So these include active contact tracking, outbreak detection, and social distance monitoring. So I'll show some results here. This is the research done by my collaborator. This is a map of Shenzhen in China, which just north side of the Hong Kong border. The work they done is just visualizing where the cases appear and where they travel, where these detected new cases traveled before they are tracked down. So they display these using heat map, and then once there are clusters of new cases or clusters of outbreaks declared or detected, it will show as a circle in the map. So this helps to find out where are tracking the cases to figure out where are the potential reasons a person contracted the virus. In terms of my own work, I had previously worked with my students on crowd counting. So the idea is that given an input image, we can use artificial intelligence technique to convert the input image into a density map. So the two rows in the two columns in the middle, they display the how dense the population are inside of the image. Okay, so the redder or the warmer color indicates the higher density, and the more toward the blue indicates the lower density. Okay, so the second column is generated by one of the previous work, and the third column is generated by our proposed approach. So the idea is that once we can convert input image into such a density map, we can do integration on all the pixels in the image and then provide a count number. Okay, so here our approach counted that there is 1,173 people. So, in the image, and the ground truth is 1,171, so which is very close to the ground truth. So we had this work for this work done before the COVID-19 hit us. So so this kind of once we are in the pandemic mode, we kind of applied this technique for social distance monitoring. So the idea is that if we can monitor how what is the crowd density in the scene, then we can help to control to prevent a particular public area to be overly crowded. For example, it could be a train station, it could be an airport, or could be a park. Once there are indications that the crowd density will be too high, then the officials can set up the kick-in approaches to prevent people going into these areas. So that is the my particular work in this area. So quick conclusion. So I personally think that data is important for fighting against COVID-19. So in order for this to work, the data should be highly detailed and should reveal useful information. And we also need a good visualization technique to make data easily, can make the data easily comprehensible. We also need the data to be shared so that different organizations can use the data, but also with the privacy protected at the same time. So we don't want to, we want to know where the cases occur, but we don't want to know the person, the patient name or things. So this information, some of the information should be shared, some of the information should be protected. Okay, so that's all for my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Meng-Lun. I know, like, I've seen a few questions and I already have some, but as usual, we'll go to each of our speakers to present, and then we'll have a general discussion. So I'll present our next speaker, Dr. Nadia Amoroso, who is a landscape architect and an assistant professor in the School of Environmental Design and Rural Development. She is the author of several books on visual communication in landscape architecture and digital design, including The Exposed City, mapping. Thank you so much, Nadia. I'll leave it to you to present.
Thank you, and my pleasure. Thank you for having me here today, Sophie, Ryan, and everyone. So my talk is a little bit different in the sense it's not directly going to speak too much about COVID, visualizing COVID. I will show the actual kind of project that was developed through my students through the grant at the end, but it's more of a general discussion about the idea of datascaping and mapping. Given my background in landscape architecture and in the environment, I wanted to give kind of more of a general overview and show some interesting kind of datascapes and maps created by others. And so that's going to be more my general talk, and I hope that that works well. You know, and then at the end, I will show some of the kind of the projects. So it is more of a general overview about datascaping. So, you know, as a landscape architect, we use maps a lot in our work. And I wanted to define what map means to us. And this is a great definition by J.B. Harvey and David Woodworth. They mentioned that maps are graphical representations that facilitate a special understanding of things, conditions, processes, or events in the human world. And maps are encoded with many layers of technical and abstract data reflecting the legal, environmental, economic, social, and political circumstances within a city. And of course, they are visual instruments that guide the individual through a city. And they can be seen as research documents and of course, as visuals that could help tell a story about the site. So I'm going to show a couple of some historical images here. Let me just go on to the next slide here. So I wanted to share this map by Dr. John Snow. This is his what's called the dot map of the London cholera epidemic in 1854. So this is his famous map that visualized and helped track cholera at the time. This map speaks about how data visualization helped lead to the discovery and source of cholera at the time. So the dots on the maps indicate the number of deaths, and the X indicate the water pumps. So they discovered a lot of people who died drank from these kind of water pumps. So the way the dots were clustered, a lot of them were near these X's. And so they realized that, that these pumps were actually perhaps contaminated, and they did further investigation and discovered that they were. And so this kind of, I would say, map helped to kind of conclude that there was some kind of contamination within the area. And so this then helped kind of resolve the issue that people wouldn't drink from those contaminated pumps. And then the number of deaths slowly started to decline after that. I wanted to share with you another kind of map that's really important in terms of us as designers and landscape architects, in terms of kind of understanding the city. This is the John Battista Noli map of Rome in 1748. And this is one of the most earliest and influential maps considered the figure ground. The figure ground is a simple way of depicting the city's solid and voids. So all the built form was basically colored in black, and all the open spaces or the voids were left in white. And this helped basically understand the whole fabric of the city and the density of the city. And this kind of mapping technique is used today in architecture, landscape architecture, and in urban design. So in my own research work, I was interested in the idea of landscapes of information. And about 10 years ago, I came out with a book called The Exposed City, Mapping the Urban Invisibles. So there's a vast amount of information pertaining to the cities, which are typically invisible to the human eye. And I was interested in how can the city and its landscape be re-imaged by these invisible forces? Things like crime rates, transportation patterns, cell phone usage, air quality. And so I started to investigate the works of landscape architects and architects from the earliest 20th century to today, and how they began to depict data in compelling visual manners, in a visual way. So one of the peoples that I started looking at was the works of Hugh Ferris. And Hugh Ferris was an architect from the early 20th century. And he was not just an architect, he was also a renderer. And that's just a fancy way of saying somebody who knows how to draw really well or visualize. And he came out with a book back in 1929 called The Metropolis of Tomorrow. And one of his kind of famous works was the depiction of the 1916 zoning ordinance of New York City. So just to kind of paint a picture, back in the early 20th century, New York started to expand, and there's a lot of skyscrapers being built in the city. And then city officials were worried that there wasn't going to be a lot of light and air, sunlight, and health into the streets of Manhattan. And so they came out with the zoning ordinance or coding or codes of the city, which allowed buildings to be set back a certain amount to allow light and air back into the city of Manhattan. The problem was that this was all done through, numbers and codes and, simple diagrams. And the general public couldn't really understand what the city would look like. And so this is what I would probably consider what's called the first kind of datascape or 3D kind of map, in which Hugh Ferris took those codes or those bylaws and started to look at how the building could be reimagined just based on data, just based on the codes. And he looked at things like setbacks, sun angle composition, and he said that this was basically the theoretical envelope or the theoretical framework in which built form could be built just based on codes. And what made this powerful was that it was done in a way, or or the visualization was done in a way that was very artistic, and it could be understood by a broad range of people, not just by architects or landscape architects or city officials, but the general public as well. And they didn't look like just kind of boring information. These were actually works of art that could be presented in galleries and actually graced the covers of the New York Times back in the early 20th century. Another figure that's important in terms of data visualization is Richard Saul Wurman. And a lot of people may know him. He's the founder of the TED conferences. He's considered an information architect. He's also, of course, a general architect as well, a designer. But his whole life, he's been interested in visualizing information, making data that's complex to understand in a much more communicative way and an effective way visually, so people could understand the information that's being presented. So back in the 60s, he developed a book that's called The Urban Atlas that examined 20 American cities at a common scale, looking at various types of data. And one of the common one that he used was residential population density. And just by looking at this graphic here of New York, you could tell right away that the circles with the filled red represents areas of higher density, and the circles that are left void or kind of half filled represent areas of lower density. So just by this quick graphic and visualization, you're able to tell by the kind of the color intensity where the higher levels of densification occurs in this city. He also looked at representing data in a three-dimensional way. And this is what's kind of interesting for me as architects and landscape architects. We read spaces in a three-dimensional way. So kind of representing population distribution as a topographical representation. So you're easily able to see the peaks of where the higher population is and where the flatness occurs in the United States. So this kind of gives the reader a quick sense of where the kind of the concentration of higher population distribution is located in the United States versus the flat areas. So this brings me to kind of the definition from maps to datascapes. And datascapes, if I kind of simplify its term, I would say datascapes are multi-dimensional representations of cities or landscapes based on the associated site. And sorry, based on the data of the associated sites. So datascapes help visualize the intangibles of often the invisible forces that shape our cities. So datascapes also serve as an architectural language that turns statistical descriptions into representations of theoretical envelopes within which built forms could be placed. So the way that datascapes are done, they can actually become representations that could help influence and actually steer the designs of the architect or landscape architect. So when I'm thinking about the idea of datascapes or data visualization, I come to this kind of marriage between the creative and the logic, or what I call the design and putting together the information. And so I kind of look at a series of things in which when I build these datascapes, you want to make, of course, the information truthful, and you want to convey the information, but at the same time, you want it to be seductive or suggestive. Like you want people to be attracted to the actual visual. You want to perhaps have areas that have some dramatic points that help tell a story. So you want to kind of have different color or different kind of height dramatification in certain areas to allow people to become more engaged into that specific point of interest. So all of these kind of points, or what I call maybe perhaps design principles, come into play when creating datascapes. And in my earlier works, I started looking at designing with data. So here is the City of Toronto census tract, and looking back at the work of Richard Saul Wurman, especially the one with the kind of the distribution of population, I wanted to create something like that for the city of Toronto. So, you know, here's a multitude or menu of data that's associated with each one of these districts. And using 3D software such as 3D Studio Max and Rhino, I manually started to kind of sculpt the landscape of population. And this is what it looked like after a bit of kind of rough modeling of that space. And then taking it to another level, making it sculptural, making the data, you know, something that people could actually touch and feel and become an art piece. So that became then carved out through what's called a CNC process, a computer numerical control process, in which the actual data becomes much more artistic. Another way of looking at it is also thinking of data that's associated to the kind of information that you want to look at. So perhaps traffic volume. I looked at the idea of networks of systems, of roadways, and how could that look like perhaps as this idea of a pulsating heart, like there's this actual movement happening onto the space. And here's like a little quick crude animation of looking at the city transportation movement as this kind of arterial beating heart. And looking at that kind of metaphor or that kind of analogy, there is this work that was done by Pedro Miguel Cruz and his team in Portugal. Now, Pedro Miguel is actually at the Northeastern University as part of the data visualization school. Here you could see the idea of looking at traffic movement as a heart, as a vessel of some sort. And at the time he was mapping the amount of taxis on a given day. And at this point, there was about 1,500 taxis, and all the dots represent that they were located with GPS trackers. And then showing the kind of the arterial roads and the faster moving roads as this kind of green, thicker vessel, and the kind of the smaller arterial roads that are stuck more, the cars are stuck more in traffic, are in this kind of thin, orangey red kind of line work that you could see that. And he took it another step further. He started to examine the way data visualization is, and looking at it and portraying it, for example, as an X-ray, or these ideas as clots into the artery. And so this is another way that he started to kind of compare data to this analogy of the anatomy as well. You know, I worked a little bit with Metrolinx at one point. They were looking to kind of bring to the forefront the visualization of the amount of people using transit in a 24-hour period. And so I looked again into these kind of little districts or tracks within the GTA and Hamilton and Ottawa area. They provided me the data, and I started modeling it in architectural computer programs such as 3D Studio Max, SketchUp, and Rhino, and then creating it again into this 3D printed export. So people could actually see it as some kind of city-like or some kind of cityscape of just data. There's this interesting project called the Human Terrain done by The Pudding, and that examines actual data across the globe, stretching from 1990 to 2015. So kind of like Google Earth, you could search and go through Toronto, Guelph, or Shanghai, anywhere in the world, and it will create these kind of peaks and valleys of the density throughout the globe based on human population. And so taking those ideas, I worked with two graduate students, Christine Peterson and Shilao Chen. They worked in looking at the University of Guelph, and they were looking at some of the works, for example, the Richard Saul Wurman dot map that he did with Manhattan. And they tried to replicate something similar to that on campus. So this is a map, just, you know, very simple, mapping a 2-meter radius on campus of all the kind of the open space. So similar to the figure ground, in this case, the buildings are left white or void in this case. So it's the reverse figure ground. And then this actually kind of shows like the more zoom in effect of the 2 meter radius with the person in the dot. And what we were looking at too is through Google Earth aerial imagery, also through kind of some speculation and students being on campus prior to COVID, you know, the kind of the filled red circles represent clusters of where people could congregate more. And so this is just a simple kind of map documenting how many people can fill the campus just in its open space. Then we took that idea and using kind of more like a parametric design, meaning inputting data into computer software. Then they replicated this as bubble spaces. So they created a 3D kind of impression of that 2 meter bubble space within campus. And then we actually carved it out again using computer numerical control process, and created this as kind of almost like a dimple board or a dimple space of the campus. And we also looked at the idea of networks in the area. So where are like the kind of the open spaces? Where are the kind of the main kind of arterial areas where people can, you know, mobilize or move or circulate throughout the city in a safer way? So we kind of, what we did is we actually put a different height depending on the level of openness and the level of kind of the widths of each sidewalk, so people could go through. So there was a little bit of an interpretation for this. And again, we wanted to make this sculptural, and we carved this out using a computer numerical control process through that. So those are some of the works. We actually have more maps that we've tested and played with, but I just wanted to show kind of the 2 or 3 that we thought, you know, would best showcase the final outcome. And just a little bit more about myself. I do specialize in representations of landscapes. I do have a couple of books or a few books out there that looks at ways in which landscapes are represented through perspectives, models, plans, and section elevations, and looking at different creative ways, either through digital, hybrid, or analog representation. So that's my little chat for today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nadia. And I'm with, I can't remember, is it Linda? Yes, I also love the mix of art and science, and as well, Rishita. I feel this is so satisfying to look at. So thank you so much. And we'll move on to our next speaker. And of course, I've turned off my iPad. Wait a second. Yes, okay, sorry. Dr. Shauna McCabe is the Executive Director of the Art Gallery of Guelph. Her previous positions include Executive Director of the Textile Museum of Canada in Toronto and Director of the Rooms Provincial Art Gallery in St. John's, Newfoundland. Dr. McCabe has also been a Canada Research Chair in Critical Theory in the Interpretation of Culture at Mount Allison University. She has presented and written on a range of museum-related topics, including art-based pedagogies, artistic activism, and the impact of art museums and their future as sources of historical knowledge. Her project, Visualizing a Virus, COVID-19 in the Context of Colonization, is funded by the COVID-19 Research Development and Catalyst Fund grant. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, Shauna.
Thanks, Sophie, and thanks for the invitation. I guess, you know, well, first I'll say my project is kind of equally creative to the others, but very different from the others as well. And we're going to be talking about art practice, which is less about sort of data and literal visualization and more about metaphor and interpretation. So first of all, I'll say that, I direct an art museum. I've been a curator now for 20 years. I've also worked in universities, and research is an ongoing, focus for me in these roles. And I see art museums as research institutions, and that, whether there are exhibitions that we're creating that are based on ideas and questions, but also through our work with artists. And throughout my work here and in the past, I've approached artistic practice as a form of inquiry that's generating new knowledge in ways that are complementary to other forms of scholarly inquiry. And so I'm always interested in sort of these interdisciplinary connections as well, because you gain more by bringing these things together. Now, if you know the Art Gallery of Guelph, or have looked at our programming, you can see that the gallery has had a really large and significant commitment to an ongoing program of work that's concentrated on inclusion, and whether that's different landscapes or histories and identities, and Indigenous voices have been a main focus of that. And since 1978, when the Art Gallery of Guelph, which was then known as the Macdonald Stewart Art Centre, was established, the galleries had a mandate to research and collect and curate both historical and contemporary Indigenous art. And today, the work of Inuit, First Nations, and Métis artists is a really a significant core of our collection, about 1,500 works within a collection of 10,000. And so there's been a commitment over that 40-year period. And when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released the calls to action several years ago, the gallery began to build on this long history of Indigenous art scholarship, and really renewed its commitment to facilitating Indigenous artists and supporting access to their work. And these practices are sources of new knowledge, right? So the work of Indigenous artists encompasses many divergent creative practices that have operated outside established Western canons of art and art history. And so, and in particular, responding to consequences of colonial histories. And because of this, they offer us new insight and new perception into historical, political, and cultural worlds. Another priority as the director of the gallery has really been responsiveness and instilling a sensitivity to the social worlds that the gallery inhabits, so that our main interface with the public, which is our exhibitions, always speak to real life and have a relevance for our communities. So when COVID, with the onset of COVID-19 and the pandemic in the spring, because of this work we've been doing with Indigenous artists and Indigenous communities, it became very clear that Indigenous communities would experience disproportionate risk, basically, due to the high degree of socioeconomic marginalization and inadequate support related to health and social services. And this is tied to higher rates of poverty, lack of access to clean water and sanitation, as well as exclusion from medical services in some cases. And and as well as the devastating ramifications for health, basically the pandemic would also exacerbate inequality based on differential capacities of communities to bear the burden of social isolation and economic impacts. It would deepen the marginalization of indigenous communities, and social distancing requirements in some cases would also undermine their ability to challenge threats to their lands, territories, and resources. And I began to, because I always think art is sort of always on the cusp of communicating issues and ideas, I was interested in the insight that artwork would provide. And I provided an essay by Sarah Milroy as a reading in advance of my talk. And I wasn't so much interested in how can contemporary art get us through difficult times, which is sort of how she frames her question. But what new knowledge could artwork provide? We have a brand new virus, we have a brand new context, brand new experiences. And as the creative work of Indigenous artists has always spoken to the impact of settler and Indigenous, settler culture on Indigenous communities and issues of forced assimilation, cultural repression and displacement. I was interested in how art practices that were emerging were going to provide a new lens within this broader context. And so these are just a couple of artworks we have in the collection that kind of speak to this history. So a pincushion, basically, that was made by beads in the early 1900s. That was part of the tourist industry. It's a work by Annie Puchuguk from 2000, a visitor by carving at my uncle's camp. This is Lawrence Paul Yakwilupton, The Indian Game, so I was looking at the influence of corporate culture in indigenous communities. And then Ruth Cuthand, whose work, Scarlet Fever, who I'll talk about in a second. So I was interested in how these practices that were emerging provide a lens on these experiences and how they visualize the virus and its impact, and not visualize, obviously, in a literal sense. More so in Ruth's case, a little bit of that, but more in terms of an interpretive approach. And so first, if we look at Ruth Cuthand's work, who is in that essay that I provided, Ruth Cuthand is a Plains Cree artist born in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, and her practice over the last decade has addressed the historical impact of viruses on Indigenous communities, documenting their devastating impact on the population. And so this image is actually from a series of 12 that each one dealt with new viruses introduced with settlement. And actually looking at the visualization of the virus itself. And these were beaded, of course, as beads themselves were the object of trade that underpinned these exchanges that were at the heart of colonization process. And when valuable furs were traded for inexpensive beads. In the early period of the pandemic, Cuthand revisited the series, adding visualization of the novel SARS virus, asking us to consider the impact of the virus for Indigenous communities within a historical context. Within the trajectory of her practice, this new work suggests the ability of the virus to devastate remote lives once more. So these are not acontextual, they actually speak to her wider practice and the narrative she had initiated a decade prior. So emerging concurrently with this, and some of you might be familiar with this, this is a project called Breathe that basically emerged using the Facebook platform to create a collective focused on creating and sharing masks, using beadwork and other traditional practices and materials in the context of and in response to the pandemic. So it started as an initiative to bring together this work. Out of that came a first exhibition that is now traveling across the country and in the United States with a selection of masks made by the members of this collective. And now a second exhibition is actually being developed out of the ongoing participation, ongoing contributions. And here's just a selection. So Naomi Smith she lives in Brantford near us. She's part of this collective, and a number of masks that were part of the first exhibition. And you can just see the variety. There's consistency, but also variation in materials and kind of conceptual approaches. So what becomes clear is the significance now of the mask itself, right? It's not so much, if you think about Ruth's work, starting with beading, moving into mask. So it's not so much just the beads anymore, but the mask has become, in the contemporary context of the pandemic, it's become, or it seems to have become, a form that speaks to the virus and contagion and health impacts, but also to strength and protection and resilience for Indigenous artists. Which when I was beginning this research was sort of, I thought that was what was happening, but I wanted to pursue it further. This was reinforced in the work of other artists, including, this is a photographer, an Inuit photographer, Barry Pottle, who's based in Ottawa. And this is part of a new series created to document elements of the virus as they manifest in the daily environment. And then this is finally is the work of Catherine Takpani, a young Inuk photographer, and she's moved from earlier work addressing murdered and missing Indigenous women to this more recent series documenting Black Lives Matter protests. And for her, photography is a way to promote equity for BIPOC communities and offer different perspectives on issues affecting these communities. And what was interesting here is she was, captured by the protest, but also by the masks. And, it perhaps points best to the intersectionality of this moment and the impact of overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination and oppression. Here's another one of her images. So within the outcomes of this project, knowledge sharing is always a key part. And so this artwork will be shared with the public. It'll be presented at the gallery this upcoming spring, so just in a couple of months. And a way to situate these practices within the trajectory of Indigenous art in Canada, with positions ranging from activism to intervention to resistance and repair. And within the burgeoning body of creative work by Indigenous artists, the mask begins to speak to the particular vulnerability of Indigenous communities in terms of the outcome of COVID outbreaks today, but also how this moment echoes the experience of colonization for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities, and clearly situating colonization not as a historical moment, an event, but an ongoing and contemporary structure that is sustained today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shauna. And wow, I love how the panel came together. Very different talks on visualizations, but all really, it's so interesting to see, from computer science to landscape architecture to art, to see everything fit together, and how the visual can help us tell that story, and how science and art meet together. Ryan, because I've been talking, I don't know if you want to start with the questions.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo that and say, I think, so for those of you who, you will know by the end, you'll hear the name Beth Finnis a fair bit, because she's another member of the planning and organizing team for the course, and has largely been responsible for assembling all of the different panels and themes and speakers. And this was by far, I would say, the most eclectic assemblage of contributors. And I, at one point, thought, okay, is this Beth just testing how far we can take, the unifying of different topics? But it worked beautifully. Really interesting. And I saw a few comments in the chat about, I didn't know this was so interesting, or I didn't know that. And that's one of the things I've been discovering too, is I didn't know some of this stuff happened on campus, but boy, am I glad I do now. It's just so fascinating. So I do have several questions. Some of them are based on in the chat, but I suppose I'm just thinking about a general question that would be for all three, and it has to do with the capacity we have now to visualize, to present, to share, to propagate information now versus, say, in previous pandemics or in the past. So England talked about now, in the 1918 pandemic, we didn't have information technology, anything, obviously, like we do now. We didn't have the capability of Google Earth and 3D printing, and we didn't have the ability to propagate the images that we've seen that have been super powerful at that intersectionality of racial issues and inequality and stuff. So how do you, I guess, but at the same time, we've seen a massive use of that for misinformation, or spreading further discriminatory, propaganda, for organizing counter protests and all that sort of thing. So I guess I'm asking, sort of on balance, do you see the capacity we have for visualization, for sharing, as an overall good in a situation like this, or are we legitimately at risk of it being, undermining efforts, or exaggerating or exacerbating inequalities or tensions and so on? I'm just, where do you think we are as far as, is this a good thing, or is it not such a good thing? Minglan, do you want to go first, just because you were the first presenter?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. I do agree with you. It's the more information we are getting nowadays, doesn't always necessarily be a good thing. So as you said, there are misinformation, there are conspiracy theory, there are some isolated cases may be overblown. For example, there are deaths caused by the vaccine. Then people may make a big thing out of it and to be argue against taking vaccine. So indeed, these are concerns, and in also the social media, they have this kind of information bubble effect. So if you pay attention, if you are always quick to the articles that you kind of fit your model of the world, then the Twitter or the Facebook will always feed you with those type of information. So you are reinforced with the information with your perception of the world or your understanding of the situation. So I think there are still people felt that the pandemic is just a hoax. Right, it's a fake, or it's nothing to worry about. So I guess that's the concern. So it's indeed can kind of make make people less equal, right? So so that's a concern. I guess the I don't know what is the best way to address this, but I think education is a key. So we should get our students or our population in general open-minded, listen to not just the ideas or just look at the facts that suit their will, fit their perception, but also look at others, right? So so that is just my my way of thinking. So there are whether it's necessary to filter out these rumors. I think in some cases we should point out they are not facts. They are just rumors, and but we should not block them completely. We should educate populations that all different facts, and hopefully everybody can derive the proper understanding of the situation. So that's my view.
Nadia?
Yeah, so a good question. So as time goes on, we have more access to information. So, you know, when I did the earlier works from the datascaping, a lot of that stuff I had to actually go to certain resources to access that. But now you could get a lot of information from any city portal, what's like an open data portal, which is great. I think any open data portal from the city, you could guarantee that the data is actual factual, like it's going to be the real information. So kind of understanding where your data is coming from, like the actual source, like with anything in literature is important where you're getting it from. So, you know, right now in getting those types of data, like from, you know, either Wellbeing Toronto or Open Data Toronto, you could access anything from, you know, demographics to population, and you can then carefully craft it yourself. So the idea of, I guess, misinterpretation, is, like as an artist, right? You don't have to literally craft everything as it is. You're telling a story. And I do mention like the idea of making certain data points more dramatic if you are telling a story that helps prove a case, right? As long as it's still truthful, but at the same time, it wants to emphasize a specific point. And that's where you kind of have to be careful with. But, you know, I guess that lends in the artist itself.
Shauna?
I would say, I mean, artists aren't trying to present facts necessarily,
Yeah.
and though critical for, you know, for shaping our way of seeing the world, I think they've, you know, they're not in the mainstream, right? You don't find artworks in the mainstream, but although we'd like them to be more mainstream. So I think, you know, from the perspective of art museums and artists, there is sort of a move to try to use those technologies and tools to kind of, you know, add creative voices to these conversations. And like the Breathe Collective, you know, use the platforms basically as a way to generate new narratives.
Yeah, I was just thinking about exposure to artists you might not see otherwise, but or
Absolutely.
imagery that you might having video or images shared online makes a huge difference. So those are great. Thank you so much for your insights, everyone. Sophie, did you want to go ahead with one?
Yes, there was a question from Jenny that I saw also a lot of people were interested in about the power, about faith and belief and visualization, and the power of visualization and visualizing data, and whether we believe it more when we see it in this graphic phase, or this artistic way, when we see data more like that. And I had like a side question, so I'll just put it in there in case you want to throw some stuff on that too, which is, you know, we haven't talked so much about it this semester, but I'm sure it will come up that, you know, over one of the themes of since March has been that sometimes the guidelines are fairly confusing, and knowing what to do can be confusing coming out, and to what extent can visualizing and visualizing of data, can it help us to understand what we're supposed to do more? So I don't know if you have some thoughts about whether we believe it more when it's in a graph or in an interactive map or in, right? So some thoughts on that? I see that you're not on mute, so.
Oh, so maybe I could go with the first one. So, you know, for example, the population distribution that was done by Richard Saul Wurman, that's a very compelling graphic. You know, people could readily understand, like through a massive amount of data throughout the United States, where the highest peaks are just through that visual, and they can understand the kind of more Central America to the West is very flat, and not as much, you know, people are residing in those areas. So, you know, having, you know, thousands of points of information just graphically represented in something and distilled in that way, allows people to have, at least at a surface level, kind of understand where things are situated. So I think, you know, more at a surface level, it allows people to understand that. And then, you know, you could go in and further analyze, okay, let's now do another data map that's still like as a 3-dimensional output in Manhattan. So you first see it as a peak, and now let's go into a more city level, then a district level, and then maybe a neighborhood level, right? So you could keep going down and down in scale. So it helps to kind of understand things at various levels of scale. So, you know, at a broader level, like across the country, I think it's great, right? It allows you to kind of distill information fairly quickly.
Thank you. I don't know if anybody's got something to add on that, or Ryan, would you allow me a side question?
Of course.
It's mostly to Shauna, because you talked about the intersectionality of this moment, and I'm wondering to what extent is it, because we're talking about, you know, art telling the story, you know, whether like it doesn't factual or not, like it's telling a story. How much is this moment, how much are you seeing this, everything coming together, Black decolonization discussions of museums and of institutions of learning, and the pandemic, and we've talked a lot last week on socio-economic struggles linked to the pandemic. How much is this inspiring artists in general in terms of really exploring it with all of these ways in which we're seeing our society in different ways? We're seeing some of the inequalities of our societies are really coming to the front.
I think, you know, I think ultimately, I mean, artists tend to be speaking from where they are. So that's what we see in the work of Indigenous artists, that's what we see in the work of Black artists. So, and, you know, that positionality is like so critical to the message that they have, and that comes from their personal experience and their specific context. And I think the issues actually come out through that, right? So, and just the complexity of this current moment is not being missed, right? It's inherent in their work, but I think each one is dealing with it from a very specific position and experience, and it's very difficult to generalize in this case. So, but you know, this moment is has brought a lot of things to the fore, and you know, whether you're an artist or an arts institution, it's impossible to ignore, right? So, and I think most people and most institutions feel a responsibility to speak to the issues and you know, move things forward in a positive way.
I think so. You hit on a really important point that's come up a few times last semester, and I'm sure will come up again this semester, which is there's not really one public, there's not really one experience, there's a wide range. And the talking about Indigenous artists expressing where they are in all of this and their understanding of the past and pandemics and so on, or epidemics and so on, reminds me of something that came up last time, which is we were talking about, you know, this is unprecedented and we've never experienced this before and so on. And we had a speaker who was an activist in the 80s during the early parts of the AIDS pandemic. And he said, I've seen this before. I mean, I've had friends that, you know, were passing away from an infection and so on. And it really makes you think, okay, that's true. And when you mention, here's 12 examples, you know, that we can talk about that have impacted this part of the people. They would have a very different thing to offer in terms of whether this is unprecedented or not. And I think that's a really important thing to kind of keep in mind, that's one reason those voices are so valuable, is that they're reminding you that not all the present is the same for everyone and not all the past has been the same for everyone. And that's really, really valuable.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I really appreciate that you brought that up. I had a quick question for Minglan. So, and it's based on a question that came in the in the chat, which is, has the method of crowd counting been applied to protests and other applications? And I guess I would throw in there, and maybe the size of inauguration crowds, which seems to be a subject of some debate and maybe relevant again tomorrow. But I mean, do you see other uses for this sort of thing in one form or another moving forward?
Yeah, it can be applied to other areas. For example, security or safety. For if you have a football game with a stadium packed with the people, you don't want people stampede each other at one of the gate or something, right? So these crowd counting or crowd density estimation at a particular in public space like this can prevent tragedy happen. So technology is always a two-sided sword. So it can be used for the good, it can be used for the bad. So the concern is that if we have so many security cameras on the street, whether that will be misused, right? So there is always concern one way or there is benefit on the other side. So how to use the information, how to ensure the fair use of the information is a very good question.
Can I do a quick follow-up for, well, maybe it's not quick, it's up to you, for Nadia, about applications of the kind of information that you explore. And I was thinking, you know, when you think, for example, about natural disasters, let's say there's earthquakes or something happens and people rethink how buildings will be designed, or how, you know, escape routes will be planned if there's been a fire in a city, or other things that affect our building or our city planning. Do you see any changes coming as a result of the pandemic, where people will rethink how buildings are designed, either with air circulation or distancing, or how cities are laid out, that will better facilitate spacing among people? Do you see kind of a fallout from the pandemic in design of our spaces?
I think one thing through the pandemic that a lot of people are appreciating is more open spaces, the value of open spaces and landscapes. Like, you know, being, I guess, secluded in one's home, right? You really value the idea of having these open spaces. And I'm sure a lot of people have seen in New York, those kind of images with the 2-meter circle around in certain parks in New York City, and so having more of those kind of open spaces, large open spaces, are very, very important. And that's why I was even showing kind of just the basic, okay, here's all the open spaces on campus, even if you occupy, for example, like the parking spaces, right? The parking lots, those are considered open spaces, how many people could actually fit there if you cluster it all together, right? And just from a basic point of view. And you can see how much they kind of dominate compared to the rest of the buildings. And so, I think that's really, really important to showcase. Buildings are of course important places, but I think the value of outdoor should be kind of take more precedent over that.
Sophie?
For some reason I had trouble unmuting myself. Sorry. I also have a question for Nadia mostly, and it's coming from 2 questions that we had in the chat a while back from Rachita and Matthew. And both are about comparing past to present. And in particular, Matthew talks about traffic volume now compared to pre-pandemic time, and is there comparison? But I was wondering also more broadly, Nadia, about cities changing, and you showed us some really cool stuff about metaphors for like heart and brains and all that kind of stuff. And like landscape architects, how much have they looked at the ways in which the cities are changing now versus what happened before, and what sort of cool visualization are you seeing coming out of that?
Yeah, so comparisons are important. So again, taking the kind of same representation, so I think that the main thing to do is always to kind of use the same kind of style or the same kind of techniques, and show like the value either being enlarged or declined, right? So you have to have that kind of comparison. So the one that I showed from the pudding, the human terrain one that worked, that's actually a website you could go on and you just Google the pudding human terrain. That actually shows, a population change from 1990 to 2015. So you could kind of compare perhaps like Guelph, you could zoom in and see if there is a change in population, the same with Toronto or any respective city that you're interested in. So I think that's really important. So that's kind of like the animation or changing over time. I think that's very important. I think what happens is, getting either satellite imaging or getting other kind of sources. If you could get, video cameras from the streets, and you could compare that from before and after. Of course, you could create interesting visualizations that show, pre-pandemic, clusters versus now in the same locations.
Thank you so much. Ryan, do you want me to follow up, or?
If you have a follow-up, my next one's a bit.
Okay, because I'm seeing Dominique as well, and Dominique, c'est le fun de t'avoir ce soir, who asks you, Nadia, also about whether we're going to see some challenges to the notion. The question just left. So do you see that we're going to have some changes in our assumption that we need to increase densities in our cities because of the pandemic spread? And do you think the COVID-19 pandemic will change our mind on city densities? And what are the ways in which landscape architects are seeing the cities evolving after this?
So like they're saying like in 50 years, like 2/3 of the populations will be in cities because of amenities and just because of various services, and people want to be in cities. But of course now with the kind of pandemic, people have this kind of more idea of the picturesque. They want to go back to the countryside, having more spaces. Again, it goes back to having more space, like more outdoor spaces. So I think the idea, the value of landscape architects, especially not just with pandemic, but also with climate change, that profession is becoming highly more regarded, because we're trying to solve kind of global world issues and environmental issues that are very important. And so a lot of landscape architects are trying to look at, for example, how to use planting, how to use kind of low-tech solutions to help mitigate, for example, stormwater or things of that nature locally, right? You know, they try to do kind of more local applications, and hopefully doing that at a larger scale throughout the globe. That will help in terms of, I would say, making a better city, or helping the city, like, you know, so it's not just, you know, all this density coming in, but we're trying to also use landscape architecture as a way to help beautify the city, to help make it more environmentally sustainable. So we are looking at different ways. You know, one thing I don't know if you saw, and we were actually involved with this project, they might have shown it back in the fall on TV. It's called the Young Tomorrow Project, in which Yonge Street, like the kind of the downtown part of Yonge Street, they want to make it more pedestrian friendly, and they're looking at actually kind of closing certain areas and making that open just for the public to walk, not having cars through there, adding more green spaces to it, right? So, you know, this, of course, the pandemic actually helped think or rethink that idea of making like streetscapes much more pedestrian friendly than they were before. So kind of reducing it to having it from 4 lanes, making it 2 lanes, and then the kind of the periphery become much more of a boardwalk, or sorry, like as a promenade. So that's, I think, kind of important. The idea again goes back to taking value on open space.
Thank you. Ryan?
Very cool. Yeah, so this is based on a question from Rashida about a lot of modeling, a lot of visualization based on data from a wide range of sources on a bunch of different parameters around the world, looking at the current pandemic. I guess it's a question about the degree to which models or visualizations are incorporating examples from past pandemics. I might expand that to talk about when you think about current expressions from artists about the situation. Is there a general sort of, well, I don't know how much has been captured actually, but is there a reflection back on how they responded artistically, say in 1918, or are computer scientists using data from that flu pandemic to kind of, I don't know, refine models or compare the current situation? I mean, how much does the past influence what you're seeing people doing now, I guess, is the main question, or knowledge of what happened in the past influencing practice now? Maybe start with Art. Do you know? I mean, are there collections from then that would have similar sort of components to them?
Not the same way, I would say, but that was one of my key questions was, just the continuity. Was there continuity? And I could see it in Ruth's work for sure, because and she was the first one I expected to respond. So because that was her focus before. And someone asked actually what was depicted, are they traditional patterns or the virus themselves? And it is the protein on the virus that she's actually depicting for coronavirus. So I actually don't know about the 1918, the Spanish flu. I'm not sure if or how artists responded. But during that same period, the beadwork that I showed was actually created at that same moment, right? And so, if we think about that as a trajectory, it's at that point, basically, the Indigenous communities had taken those beads and actually were starting to create almost Victorian objects, right? Because the audience was a white settler audience, right? And they realized, just for basically economic reasons that they could, this is a way of making a living by selling those beadwork pieces. So it was a very different moment, and now there's much more of a self-consciousness, and using this artistic practice in a way to look at the virus itself and look at its impact, and aware and self-conscious, I would say.
Well, I think that, so you answered a question that had come up a few times, but also I think just that's an example maybe where visualization has trickled into the artistic practice. I mean, we're all very familiar with that image of a coronavirus now, but that's because we have electron microscopes and the internet, right? And that would have been certainly different in 1918. Minglan or Nadia, in terms of do past pandemics, to the extent that the data are, reliable and accessible, do they get incorporated into visualizations or models that you're using in the current situation?
What would have been interesting, I really liked the works that I showed earlier of Hugh Ferris, where I used charcoal, the charcoal drawings to actually express the kind of the building envelope of the 1916 zoning ordinance of New York. It would have been interesting if he did a visualization of the 1918 pandemic, because it was closely around that time, and how he would model that in 3D. So, that would be one interesting thing if, you kind of model it, not even just in computers, like, I'm really intrigued by the charcoal drawings and comparing those as kind of this landscape of disease, right? What is the kind of the landscape that's created just based on the outbreaks, and making that into a 3D representation. And it could be through charcoal drawings or even paint. It doesn't have to necessarily be a computer rendering.
Right. Yep.
From the computer science point of view, I don't aware of any data visualization was conducted for the 1918 pandemic. I think the key reason is that the data back then is not reliable, it's incomplete. Even the death toll is a rough estimate between 20 to 100 million. And so that makes it hard to do serious visualization. So for visualization to work, I think the data accuracy is the key. I read that the previous pandemic is spread around because of the World War, because of the colonization. So at the time, the people doesn't travel as much, right? If it wasn't World War, probably it will be more constrained to a local area rather than a world pandemic. Nowadays, the international travel and all make things flow around virus travel very fast. So that actually make it important to the data is important to see how the virus are jumping from country to country. I wouldn't surprise that in the next century, it's 100 years from now, and probably people will be tagged, and then individual movement can be gathered, so data will be accurate. So the tool for fighting the future pandemic could be very well much more informed, say, on who you contact with. So, well, respecting the privacy on one hand, but if things happen, then this information can be accessible by whoever have the authority to do that.
Sophie, did you have a question?
Yes, I would feel I need, having Shauna here, I want to ask about the art gallery of Guelph during COVID-19 more broadly, but also a few weeks from now, we're going to have Don Owen, who is the curator of the Guelph Civic Museum, and Queen from the Guelph Black Heritage Society come to talk to us about the Rapid Response Project and collecting individual experiences of COVID-19 given in the context of Black Lives Matter. And in our conversations with Don, and I think tonight's your presentation fits so well with some of the things that Don and Queen will highlight for us in the next few weeks. But in our conversations with Don and when we talked about ways in which museums and galleries are really rethinking their mandates, their goals and approaches, and have been for a number of years in relation to the Truth and Reconciliation recommendations, in relations to inclusivity, decolonization. And you've talked about this tonight as well. And so I was wondering about your thoughts on ways in which this movement was already happening and well in place in all galleries and museums, and ways in which COVID-19 is going to, and we've had Nadia talk a bit about this, cities and how they might change. Might change museums and art galleries in that context where that discussion was already happening, from what you collect to what you exhibit to how you exhibit it, all those kind of questions, and the space itself as well, right? Ways in which it might evolve. And I think Cass talked about, are we going to see more art outdoors, artwork, sculptures, graffitis, that type of thing?
Yeah, well, I think so much is changing and so much is still evolving. So we're in the midst of it. So it's hard to see. One of the things, I'll just speak to the outside, like when I was teaching the history course last term, that looked at, the impact of movements like Black Lives Matter and movements for Indigenous sovereignty on museums. One of the things we were looking at are things like, the challenge to monuments in the public landscape, but so much of the art that developed in the midst of COVID, because it was COVID, in cities around Black Lives Matter was outside, right? So we had these, very ephemeral, artworks going up on walls and on sidewalks and buildings, and and some of those are permanent, some of those are temporary, and then even more deliberate spaces being used by initiatives, artistic initiatives, and smaller organizations, but also by larger organizations thinking about how do we actually reposition our program outside. So I would say, we're looking at everything, and I think most institutions are. And, for us, for the Art Gallery of Guelph, we actually were quite lucky. We were able to open in July and be open through December. So there are some institutions that haven't opened since last March, especially those associated with universities. So we were quite lucky. But at the same time, right now we're actually installing exhibitions despite not being open, because we want to be ready to open when we can. And we will program, basically, a lot of our program went online immediately. And every institution is at a different point, a starting point with that. So some institutions are very far ahead digitally, some are not. And so, in the case of the Art Gallery of Guelph, we didn't have a strong education program online yet. So that's been, really, it's a learning curve, but it's also really good for the institution, right? Because it's material and skills that we really needed to sort of master. So, I think a lot of institutions are thinking about how to respond to that. Our space, nothing touchable anymore, even benches, not as much sitting room. But those, like Sophie says, they were already in process because of accessibility issues. A lot of the ways that people had navigated and built museums historically just didn't work anymore. So we actually have an opportunity to kind of rewrite how we organize our spaces. So it's not without its benefits in some ways, we had already a very sort of strong inclusive collecting program, and now as a result of Black Lives Matter and other kind of movements at the same time, we've really rededicated to that. So just before the holidays in the fall, basically we had an exhibition of probably about 30 recent acquisitions by BIPOC artists. That was also connected to the class that I was teaching for history. So it's, every institution is navigating it a different way. We're also thinking about, art museums are thinking about how do you support artists, right? So if we can't exhibit them, and some institutions can't, then can we actually create digital residencies, for example? That's one thing we're doing with artists who are going to be showing with us in the next year, is involving them in a more in more depth, involving them in programs that actually lead up to the exhibition as to just the exhibition, as opposed to just the exhibition. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think every institution is working it out.
It does, and I think the thing is the course is over a whole semester, and so we keep asking questions panelists over time, and we get more and more into these issues. And I will say, for those who, so Shauna teaches in my department, the Department of History, and we're really thrilled to have her give our students experiences and in the art gallery of Guam. That's what you were referring to a few times in there.
One of the things we did do this summer with the community is actually a rapid response project, is because we're working with the artist and graphic novelist Seth, who's working on a living room for the front lawn, for the front of the gallery. We actually invited the community to capture their own living spaces, and we published a collection called Living Rooms, basically, that's available online, that basically it includes work from our collection around that, but also community contributions, and then contributions by children in our summer camps.
Oh, that's awesome. We'll have to look at it. Ryan, I think we're getting to the end.
Yeah, we're pretty close to time up. I want to thank the 3 panelists tonight. What an interesting group. You know, again, I wasn't sure how this would all come together, just not because I thought any one presentation wouldn't be awesome, but because I wasn't 100% sure how we were going to merge this into a single discussion, but it was fantastic. Always a lot to think about, and one of the real joys I think of this course is learning what other people on campus are doing, that, you know, departments that we don't necessarily know much about each other, and I think that's been really, really interesting to see. And I've really enjoyed seeing in the chat as well alumni from who were in the landscape architecture program talking about what they're doing, right? And so I'm sort of hoping that most of the alumni and the students will see at least one field that they're quite familiar with represented, and learn from a bunch that they're not as familiar with. So that's been great. And I just want to thank you all for great presentations, very insightful answers to the questions. I got a lot out of this, and I think everyone else did too. There is just a little bit about next week. So Colin, if you have the slides there. Yes. And now I forget if this is me or Sophie. I think it's
that's you.
Whenever I say I think I forget if this is me, it's me.
I almost said your turn, Ryan.
Yeah. All right. So just a quick reminder that for the students enrolled in the course, your seminars do start this week. And so you'll be connecting with your TAs, and you'll be engaging in some smaller group discussions where you can play with some of these ideas more and explore them. You'll be receiving an email and also be on CourseLink, the questions that will be available for you to work on, which are due next week on Monday at 5. And
we're sending the email tonight.
We usually meet right after these, come up with questions based on the discussion, and then send those as soon as we can. And then once you've had one of these, when you've gone through that process, you'll see what we're looking for and what's going on. And just a reminder that next week we have a new topic entirely, which is public reactions to COVID-19, featuring, actually, I saw you in here, Yuan Fangling.
Yes.
From Marketing Consumer Studies, Saba Safdar from Psychology, and Andrew Papadopoulos from Population Medicine, another relatively eclectic group.
We'll see.
I hope we see you all next week. Thank you so much for coming. And again, thanks to our amazing speakers tonight. We really appreciate you spending your time with us. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night. Thank you. Good night.